Hello folks, you're very welcome to this, our third webinar in the series Moving Forward Together in Hope. And this webinar features Susan Pascoe from Australia. Susan is part of a working group involved in the preparation for the Global Synod this coming October. So Susan Pascoe, it's lovely to talk to you in Australia. And the last time I was chatting to you, Susan, you were just back from a planning session for the Global Synod in October. And when I met you, you were minding your grandchild. So how did that all come about, Susan? Tell us.
Well, I'll start with the Roman experience and then perhaps the grandchild. The Roman symposium was convened to examine the listening methodology that's been used at all stages of the Synod so far. It may not be familiar to people, but it's called a conversation in the spirit, and it involves a particular methodology where people begin in a prayerful state, speak first of all of their own experience of church, uninterrupted, and that's quite a challenge for some people. Then after everyone's had an opportunity to speak, there's the again silence and prayer, a second round where people begin with a phrase usually, from what I've heard, this resonated with me, this unsettled me, and so on. So that, but what they're doing is they're reflecting on what they've heard other people say, and then another pause, more silence and reflection, and then dialogue between people, unstructured dialogue between people. That's an incredibly good way of people growing in understanding of one another. But there was also a thought that there are lessons from the social sciences that perhaps we can bring to these methodologies. And that was the purpose of the symposium. Reflect on, and remember, we've now had 3 stages: the stage of listening and discernment in local churches, then at the continental level, we think of it as regions, and then at the global level through the assembly. So that was a really, I think, great opportunity for those of us who've been involved to sit with academics and researchers and think through what could be improved. And that was in the leading into the Easter week, and some of us had the extraordinary riches of staying on and participating in the Triduum, the Easter services. And I can elaborate further on that if you like, but of course, for those of us with families, reality hits as soon as you get home. It was school holidays, and my husband and I aim to do as much as we can with childminding during the school holidays. I'm not sure about Ireland, but in Australia, most jobs have 4 weeks holiday, but there are, between the school terms and the summer break, there's nearly 12 weeks that children aren't at school. So it's a lot of time to be covered. But of course, it's a joy for grandparents to have their grandchildren as well. So I sometimes think of it as one of the greatest experiences of reciprocity or mutuality. Your children are very happy to have a break from their children, our grandchildren. We're very happy to have them. So it works very well.
Okay, and there weren't too many grandmothers in Rome with you for that work on the synod. Would I be right in that?
I think that absolutely, and indeed, if you think about particularly the assembly, it was only about 6 months before it was conducted that Pope Francis announced that there would be non-bishops for the first time at a synod of bishops. So it's quite an extraordinary step. He then asked that each of the continents, and there are 7 in the world, the church breaks them up into 7 groupings. One of the groupings is the Middle Eastern churches. So that's why it's somewhat unusual and called continents. But the Pope asked that each of the continents send 20 names, at least half of which had to be women, and they, of course, non-bishops, because they were already, the Episcopal conferences had already nominated their bishop representatives. That meant that on the floor of the synod, you had about 15, nearly 16% women. So you could be critical of that and say, well, that's a low percentage, but actually for a bishop's meeting, and considering that there were men and women who, the Pope took 20 names and selected 10 from each of the continents. So it was quite significant. It was a good way too for religious women and men to become more involved, because in the past they've only had 5 members at previous synods. So that was important as well. But I think the voice of people from all roles in the church, whether they're in single, whether they're married, whether they're in religious life, whether they're priests or bishops and so on, I think it's very important to have all those perspectives considered.
Okay, and Susan, you have an inside seat in terms of the whole process. And what's your read of the significance of that wider synodal process, that global synodal process?
I think it's very significant, possibly transformative. There will be some dioceses, some parishes that already have had, whether they've been assemblies or synods or diocesan pastoral councils, they've already had means of engaging with the lay people and having them more actively involved in the life of the parish or the church, the diocese or whatever. But for those dioceses that didn't, it was very significant, because I explained a little while ago that process of the conversation in the Spirit, that was to bring in an invitation to anyone who is baptised, all of the lay faithful, to make a contribution. Now, we know that there was a process of self-selection, and we know, and this was indeed raised at the symposium in Rome in March, that one of the real challenges is that there are whole categories of people who don't bring themselves forward, and it's whether they feel as though they don't have a high enough level of education, whether, whatever, if it's English, it's not their first language, whether they've got a disability of some sort, and so on. There are many reasons, whether, of course, they've one of the categories where they feel at the margins of the church, divorced and remarried, or LGBTQ. There are people who didn't participate. So in the recent round of consultation, where the synthesis document for the assembly was sent back to the continents, we were asked again to reflect on what had come from the assembly, the themes that had come from the assembly, and reflect on what it might mean through the prism of your lived experience in your part of the world. There was a real effort to bring in those who hadn't been included before. And in the communication that came from the Synod Secretariat, it was really clear that they wanted bishops and priests and congregations, anyone organising a listening and discernment or consultation session, to really make sure it was as open as possible. And I think that there's been improvements there. And most of the people listening today would also be aware that only last week there was a meeting in Rome where there were representatives of the priests of all of the countries where there are, the church is operating. They met for 4 days and they considered the themes from the synod, because curiously there's been a sense through each of the stages, in local churches, continental, and in the level of the universal church, that the voice of priests has been almost absent. And there's many reasons probably behind that. Certainly the voice of bishops is there, but to make sure that the voice of priests is there, because given their role in parishes, the priests are absolutely fundamental to the church operating in a synodal way.
Okay. And where do you see it going, Susan? You know, over the next few months, there'll be preparations for October. October is going to happen. And I think there's a sense that something will land in October. Have you a sense around that?
I do, and I hope it's not going to be one that disappoints people. So this week, the summaries from each of the Episcopal conferences have gone. They're then drawn together at the continental level. I think that's happening, I know in our region, we're Oceania, that's happening next week. And then that's sent to Rome. There's a meeting in Rome from early June for 2 weeks, where a group of people have been invited to draw together from the 7 continents what are their reflections from what they heard come from the assembly in October 23. That then is written into a document that in English we'd say a working document. In Latin it's an instrumentum laboris, and that instrumentum laboris goes to every member of the assembly that's going to be conducted for all of October 24. Now, the reason I said I might disappoint people who are hoping that we'll see whistles and bells at the end of October 24 is that about a month ago, the Pope announced that there would be 10 working groups to deal with some of the complex issues that had arisen during the 23 assembly. And those working groups comprise experts, so they're typically theologians, canon lawyers, ecclesiologists, you know, that's about church, people with expertise in church and so on. But they're also members of the Roman departments, which are called dicasteries, the Roman dicasteries, and they're meeting in groups. They've got to provide interim reports to the Synod Assembly in October, so all 10 of them. They continue working and they've got to provide reports to the Pope by the 25th of June 25. So I don't think we'll hear from the Pope until August or a bit or later, 25. Now, that might seem like a very long stretch, but some of these issues really go to the heart of what it is to be church. And it's very important, I think, that the people involved, the experts involved, have the time to get it right. And of course, there's still the deliberations from the assembly itself. That will go into the mix. And again, people viewing this webinar would probably be aware that ultimately it's the Pope who makes the decision. So all of this material is forwarded to him, and then he will respond. And obviously he's going to respond in the light of what's given to him and church teaching, to church tradition, scripture, and so on.
Okay. And would you have a sense, Susan, no, and I don't want to be putting you in the spot, but would you have a sense of what way is the wind blowing?
Look, some issues are already being given clarity, I think. So the recent release by the Dicastery for the Doctrine of the Faith on Fiduciae Supplicans, on the dignity of the human person, has really clarified a number of matters that were raised in the assembly. And that, I think, that may happen with other areas as well. That document was in development for 5 years, so it's not as though it's trying to race ahead of the outcomes of the assembly. Certain areas were contentious, as was clear, and one of them, for example, was the role of the deacon, and it was both the role as it exists now, where it's only a role where there are male deacons, but also the potential to have women ordained to the diaconate. So I think that's going to be one that will have very serious consideration, and that matter's already been under consideration. I think the reason I'm hesitating a bit is that the world moves on while we're deliberating. So, for example, the Australian Catholic bishops this week have finalised a recommendation for a liturgy in the Indigenous languages of Australia, and there are many of them. But one of the issues that was in the Synod was a request from many countries to have a less Eurocentric approach to liturgy, so that there can be expressions, and it may well be in music, in dance, in movement, from churches in non-European parts of the world, which are the way we celebrate Eucharist in particular ways. Other places want to celebrate it in other ways. So I think that there's movement. I know, for example, I'll use more Australian examples. Well, even look at Kerry in Ireland. You've been getting on with it. You've been having consultation in parishes. You've been considering how you operate as church with the active involvement of lay people. And there are many similar activities happening in Australia, where there are synods underway, assemblies underway, meetings of the lay faithful with their pastor, and considering many of the issues that have come from the synod, or just how do they want to be church in that diocese. So I think that the way of being church that is animated by synodality is a mode of church where all of the baptized have a greater opportunity to contribute their gifts. And Pope Francis often refers to the fact that we're all missionary disciples. You can't just leave it to those who are consecrated or ordained. So thinking of ways in which we can contribute, lay people in particular can contribute to the life of the church. And for many, that's the word that's used is co-responsibility, so that there's a greater involvement. Already there's an involvement usually in finance councils, pastoral councils, but thinking about ways in which the lay people can be involved in the life of the church.
Okay, and Susan, you'd mentioned there about Kerry, and maybe I just focus in on that for a minute. You know that the 53 parishes of the diocese were asked to have consultations. Lay people were asked to organise the consultations. All 53 parishes did, and they gathered about 2,000 people. And the meetings were characterized by high energy. People were keen on a future for faith, a future for church, and were keen to participate, to embrace co-responsibility. At the same time, they had questions about those who weren't there, and particularly the young, like the young parents and their children. Also, they had concerns about how in practice will synodality work out. What are the respective roles of priests and people, particularly in situations where you no longer have resident priests in the parish? Synodality involves meetings and so on, and it's not going to be practical for priests to be attending at meetings across whole pastoral areas. So those were some of the questions, and I'm just wondering, do you have any observations on those meetings?
Perhaps, Martin, I can respond by making reference to other places that might assist with the thinking in Kerry. So, for example, part of the consultation for the synod was called a digital synod, and it was run through Vatican Media, and there was an extraordinary level of involvement. Some 38,000 people responded to an online questionnaire. There was an incredible richness. And what emerged from that was a thirst for people to know God, to have a spiritual life. So that's really significant. And now a second dimension of that, some people in Ireland might have heard of Bishop Robert Barron, who has an online presence. He's got something like 5 million followers. And he talks about going to where the people are. They're in the digital world. And so I think there's real questions for us. Now, we're not all going to be media stars like Bishop Barron, but there are questions, I think, about is parish geographically bound in the way it was in the past? And if you think about during COVID, we went to online masses. We learned to congregate differently. So that's a couple of the digital and from from both the Vatican and the US perspective. But the other thing in terms of community, I was fascinated both in the Pacific and in some of the sessions that I facilitated in Rome last October. A number of the African bishops, and they talk about this in the Pacific, are basic Christian communities. And these are communities of people who are generally in areas where there are not priests, and they just get on with it. Now, of course, they can't consecrate the Eucharist, but they can get together. They can have a liturgy of sorts. They can share. They can read scripture. There's lots of things that they can do together. I'm giving those examples to say that having seen some of the Kerry material, I do think that there's a grappling with some similar issues and finding the way to be church, to be community, and to be together when you don't have a resident priest. That's going to be part of the challenge, and maybe some of it will be drawing resources from digital sources which can be global in nature, but some of it will be getting together, human connection, cups of tea, whatever it is, that still means that part of church, which is about community, remains into the future. So I think some of the issues raised in Kerry, you're seeing absolutely everywhere. And they certainly came through the consultations in the first phase of the Synod. There were 112 countries that responded out of 114 countries where the church exists. Very similar issues to the issues raised in Kerry. So, if anything, it's one way of saying that the people in Kerry are not alone. They're people at this, part of human history are grappling with similar issues.
Okay, one of the people involved in an earlier webinar in this series, Susan, he felt that and he was saying this positively, that Rome is making it up as it goes along, in the sense that it hasn't worked out clearly the practical implications of synodality yet, and that those are still to be worked out. So the reality of how parishes will be organized, particularly without resident priests, how synodality will work out in practice, that is still to be resolved. Is that fair enough, do you think?
Martin, we have a saying in Australia for a situation like that we're building the plane as we're flying it. And that was commented at the Assembly. And I think that's fair because it hasn't been done before. Well, it has been done. If you go back and read the Acts of the Apostles, that was the nature of the early church. So you have to go back a bit in history. And so I don't find that intimidating. I think that, in fact, it gives enormous room for creativity. And in the same way as many communities, particularly non-European communities, are wanting localism in the liturgy, there can be localism in the ways that the parishes organise themselves, and they may not be as geographically based, or part of their time together may not be as geographically based.
Okay. I'm wondering at this point, Francis, do you want to come in?
In terms of a question, I suppose, Martin and Susan, what's striking me is you mention a number of times to be church. I'd love you to expand on that, because it's not maybe a phrase that we use here in Ireland as much.
I'll begin by reflecting. There's an Australian scholar, Father Orm Rush, who's an expert on Vatican II. And one of the things he's written about is the way in which the people of Papua New Guinea responded to Vatican II. So we know around the world there was a variable response. They responded with an initiative called We Are Church. And that has meant that the lay people have had a voice and an involvement, really probably pre-Vatican II, but particularly post-Vatican II. And one of the very powerful moments in the Synod Assembly in October was when a woman from PNG, Grace Rakia, spoke about being church in a country like PNG, which, for those you know, in the diocese who are not familiar, it's in the Pacific, close to Australia, is incredibly rich in culture and cultural diversity, biodiversity, but it is a country with development needs, and there are levels of poverty that, you know, the country is still working with, but that hasn't in any way diminished their enthusiasm for church and their celebration of being church and their involvement in church. So I think that's what I mean. I wonder if those of us who were, you know, born last century, our sense of church was that the church was owned by the priests and the bishops, and that we came dutifully and, you know, we responded as was expected. And, you know, when you look at some of the documents that were written at the time, they talk of a docile flock. They use that word, whereas I don't think Pope Francis would ever use the word docile to describe the lay people. He wants the lay people to be vibrant, active, involved, contributing their gifts. So that's, I think, when we talk of we are church, well, yeah, we are all. But of course, we've got to, first of all, be faithful. You know, you could be baptized and have no further association with the church from that point. And you've got to operate also in good faith. There's a very good document written by the International Theological Commission on the sensus fidei in the life of the church, but that sense of the faithful. But it does have the caveat that it's got to be people of good faith, operating in good faith, when they are deliberating on matters in relation to the church. And I think we saw that very much at the Synod Assembly, and certainly also, I bet you witnessed it in the various meetings around in the diocese of, the parishes of Kerry. So it's that sense of the church actually is all of us. And one of the dimensions of clericalism is it's multidimensional, but part of it is the lay people reticent, not feeling that they have the agency to be part of the church. But from where I sit, when Pope Francis wrote to the people of God, put the letter on the internet, didn't send it out through the normal channels, and it was August 2018, a crisis moment in terms of the handling of sexual abuse. Multiple reports had come in that year. And that letter clearly says, you know, we need you. We can't, the church needs all of the people of God to get involved in solving this problem. So that says to me, that you have the agency, and a whole lot of synodality, I think, is about expressing that lay people do have the agency. I think here's an interesting, not well-known fact, but if you look at the synthesis report from the October 23 Synod, the second most used word is formation. And so that's the qualifier I put on when we say we're all church. Yes, but those people who have dedicated their lives to the church, the clerics and religious, they've had years of formation, and there's a real need for lay people who want to be actively involved in the life of the church to have access to formation so that they can make a full contribution, and also have the confidence to make that full contribution.
I think you're right. I think formation is key to people having a confidence and maybe a sense of the world in which they're operating in that regard. But I think what we don't maybe perhaps remember is that lay people are bringing a huge amount of professional expertise and wisdom from their working world, which the church also needs. So I think it'd be a shame to lose sight of.
I was going to say, I agree entirely. And in fact, in my own career, I've worked between church and government. So, for example, I was Australia's first charity commissioner. So I've had involvement in the church in senior roles and in government in senior roles. And when you look at the particularly, say, governance, which is really, that's another element that's come through the Synod at all levels, but the Assembly as well, the need for improved governance. Much of that relates to greater levels of inclusion, particularly the laity. Then you begin to get more women involved, but also higher levels of transparency and accountability.
In saying, you know, there were 15 to 16% women present at the Synod. And while that is an increase on 0%, it's a long way it is a long way from what we would desire. How do you hold faith and hold hope when we are a long way from what we desire in the 2020s?
Well, it's a challenge, and there, through the 3 levels of listening and discernment, there was an absolute cry from the heart from women. And for some women, wanting a greater involvement in the sacramental life of the church, and that's not likely to happen soon. Although, interestingly, in my own parish, for Mother's Day recently, the parish priest asked a mother, and not for a reflection, but to give the homily. Now, that's probably, you know, a small breach of a rule, but these are important steps, I think, in terms of a sense of inclusion. Actually, I'm about to get involved in a piece of work at the moment where we're looking at the governance form, the ministerial public juridic person, but it's in the same way a PJP, a public juridic person, is a form in canon law, and that vests authority in the parish priest, in the bishop, and in the congregation. The ministerial PJP vests control in entities that are formed, usually but not exclusively, by religious who no longer have the members to maintain their ministries, and then those lay people will ensure both the stable patrimony, in other words, they're protecting the assets, but also the fidelity to mission in perpetuity, because of course, you know, entities created for the church are created in perpetuity. Now, in Australia, that's quite a popular model. So we've got 14 of them now. They're very large. Like I'm for example, I'm a trustee of St John of God. Now, I know this probably sounds crass, but we are a $2 billion enterprise. We're one of the largest companies in Australia. We've got 18 private hospitals, a number of ministries in disability, in mental health, and so on. We're a very large enterprise, but we're a ministry of the church. We are church. Now, when you look at the MPJPs in Australia, the majority of chairs are women, and at least half of the members are women. So the issue of governance, so we know we've got the sacramental life of the church, but there's the governance life of the church. I think there are ways in which women can have very active roles. Again, I'll use the Australian experience. If you look at ministries of the church in Australia, whether they're in education, so principals of schools, directors of Catholic education, hospitals, hospital CEOs, and so on, many women are in these roles, many. So there's movement. It is happening, probably not enough, and probably not with sufficient attendant addressing the theology. I don't know if everybody read, but there was a report, I think, in Vatican News of Pope Francis addressing the Pontifical Commission for Theology. I think it was just before Christmas, but he asked them to demasculinize theology. That's the word he used. I thought that was absolutely fascinating. And I think one way in which that's going to happen, and I think you're alluding to this, you need women there. In many parts of life, I'm thinking of the Indigenous community in Australia, they often say nothing about us without us. And we could say the same for women, right? You know, nothing about us without us. It's very difficult if they're not involved. So I know I'm speaking mainly from the Australian experience here, and it's not the same in every country, but there is quite a significant improvement, and some of that improvement is in what emerged from the assembly, which is decision taking. The church tends to distinguish between decision making or advising and decision taking or the deliberative act. So that's another long-winded response. I hope it's addressed your issue.
How do you keep heart as a woman in your local parish, in your local area? How do you keep heart with a church that is very clerical and very masculine?
I think it is difficult. Some of it depends on the persona of the parish priest, and there are parish priests who are very inclusive, and so it's not as difficult, but I think it can be a challenge. I think I'm hopeful that coming from the assembly, and I've just explained the whole deliberative process around it, but as I was saying to Martin earlier, the world's not standing still. So associated with that, you know, you've got Pope Francis saying demasculinize the theology. So I know it takes a long time for change to occur, but part of it, I suppose, I would encourage people to have agency, and there's no reason why parishioners can't be initiating activities, and whether it's scriptural readings, or it might be fundraising, it might be community, it might be, I think a lot of people, for example, I don't know how active the St Vincent de Paul Society is in Ireland, but it's very active in Australia. A lot of lay people find an ecclesial community within their St Vincent de Paul chapter, because they do pray together. They do good works, but they do pray together as well. So I think for some people, the lay movements are very significant in terms of where they find church, and maybe they're our equivalent to what I was mentioning earlier to Martin, you know, that sense of a basic Christian community where Christians get together and collectively act. But look, it is hard. I think one of the challenges is that we are a global church, and where community values and practices are in Ireland or Australia, they're not necessarily in other parts of the world, and trying then to get a response that's going to suit every situation is difficult. You probably saw that the African bishops reacted very negatively to the Pope's pastoral statement that there could be the blessings of people, LGBTQI plus couples. Most of them, not all of them, reacted very negatively to that. So, and yet at the same time, they had asked at the assembly for a reconsideration of polygamy. So you can see that there are different cultural elements at play there. And there are differences, of course, in the role of women in parts of the world as well. But I just encourage women to have agency, and maybe where you can express your faith, you know, take those opportunities. Maybe join a board of your local school, because there'll be something, you Catholics, I'm saying Catholic school, or if there are vacancies in one of your Catholic hospitals. Many of the ministries of the church, the people on those boards do have tremendous opportunity, both for prayer together, but also for formation together. But I'm not underplaying the real challenges there are for women operating in their parishes, and we continue. I sometimes say to people, it's step by step. You know, we just take one step at a time.
So maybe just a final observation, Susan. The thing that strikes me most from talking to you today and from our previous conversation is that there's a joy in I think you exude a sense of joy, and like you're immersed in family life, you're immersed in your local church, you're also immersed in your local community. You've seen the center of the church very close up. And at a time when a lot of people really are despairing about the future of church, people who love the church, but nonetheless are fierce anxious about, is this whole thing going down the tube? You have a sense of joy and a positive sense. Is that a fair reflection on you?
I think it is. I mean, it is interesting that in some of the latest data, like for example, from France, they had their highest number of baptisms in years over the recent Easter period, and the Pew research in the States is finding that it's only a trickle, it's a slow increase in the number of people identifying as Catholic. So it's possible that there's green shoots out there. But the other thing is that when you think of the travesty and the tragedy of the sexual abuse crisis, it's almost as though we have to go back to our basics and rebuild. And one of the reasons that I emphasised governance with Francis is that from the very deep analysis that was done over a 5-year inquiry here in Australia, some of the problems emerged because of poor governance, lack of transparency, lack of accountability. So when we look at where we're heading in the future, if we want to go back to the Acts of the Apostles for some guidance, it was messy. They fought amongst themselves. But they did it on a communal basis. So if you ask me, as you did, do I have a sense of optimism and hope and joy? I do, but that's not a naive hope. There's a lot of work to be done, and much of that work involves the restoration of credibility in the church following the abuse crisis. And we can't ignore that, and we can't walk away from that. But I do see synodality as one of the ways, not the only way, but one of the ways in which the church can examine herself, have a greater involvement of all the baptized, and work toward a much more robust future, and particularly one grounded in the scripture, one where we go back to the word.
All right, folks, that's it. I want to thank Susan very much for being with us, and I thank all of you who have taken the trouble to view this video. God bless.
Yeah, Martin, and you can then just do the conclusion part for us now at the end. Just to thank Susan very much, and thank everybody for attending. That's all.
All right, folks, that's it. I want to thank Susan very much for being with us, and I thank all of you who have taken the trouble to view this video. God bless.
Perfect. Job done. We'll stop the recording. Technology gone mad.